What's going on, everyone? So welcome to my latest video. This is part of a series where I focus on a specific director and rank that director's work from worst to best. Now, I've done such directors in the past such as Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, Wes Anderson, Spike Lee, Christopher Nolan, and many more directors. You guys can check out those directors and those many more directors in my director ranking playlist down below. But guys, you clicked on this video, so you know it. This time around, I am focusing on George Lucas's films and ranking them from worst to best. Now, keep in mind, a lot of times people do believe that films that he produced, that he directed, but he actually didn't, such as like Star Wars 5 and Star Wars 6. He didn't actually direct those films. So keep in mind, this will not be films that George Lucas produced. It will not be films that he directed that were short films, music videos, TV movies. No. Specifically speaking, films that he directed. And as of the filming of this video, which is January 11th of 2025, George Lucas has directed 6 films, so I'll be ranking them from 6 being his worst to 1 being his best, and of course, my humble opinion. Now, it goes without saying, but your ranking list will be different from mine, and that's what's great about film as an art form, is that it is subjective. So I look forward to seeing what your ranking list looks like in the comment section down below. But guys, enough exposition. Let's get started. So kicking things off with my number 6, we have Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. So this movie has a very interesting premise. I actually think the premise is the biggest suit of the film that I'm like, oh, this had so much potential. And unfortunately, in execution, it was very lackluster. The dialogue, the acting, the directing, the guiding of the action scenes. The action scenes in particular, when I was younger, I actually really dug it. But I rewatched this movie recently, and it really was disappointing. It's a movie that has aged very poorly, especially from a visual standpoint, and the movie just won't shut up. There are so many instances where it's like, come on, film as an art form is show, don't tell. But there was just constant talk. And maybe things would be better if the dialogue was interesting, but unfortunately it's not. So you're left with a movie that has an interesting premise, but in execution, it's very, very sloppy. And again, it's one of those movies I want to like, but alas, here we are. I'm not a fan of this movie, and that's why it's my number 6. Next up, my number 5, we have Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Now, everything that I just said about Attack of the Clones is applicable to The Phantom Menace. Interesting premise. There is a lot of possibility to it where it actually could have been a really good movie, but unfortunately it's not. What makes this movie slightly better than Attack of the Clones is that there is a pretty cool lightsaber battle at the end. If you haven't seen this movie, I'm not going to spoil who it's between, but it's a pretty cool 5-minute scene. And that alone is what elevates this movie above Attack of the Clones. Even though on paper, you would think that I would like Attack of the Clones more, in execution, Phantom Menace has that lightsaber battle that elevates it slightly. But still, it's not a good movie in the slightest. And that's why I have it as my number 5. Next up, my number 4, we have Star Wars 3, Revenge of the Sith. So this is a movie that for the longest time, it was one of, if not my favorite Star Wars movies. But when I rewatched it recently, I realized that it's a pretty middle-of-the-road movie. It's definitely the best in the prequel trilogy, hands down, but it's really not saying that much. I definitely understand why a lot of people love this movie, especially if you love that style of action scenes in regards to like lightsabers where it's like going really fast. I get that, and I do also understand why people would like this movie, especially if you haven't seen Godfather 1 and 2, because there are a lot of scenes that are quite literally lifted from the first Godfather film. Of course, the Godfather films are much better, but I understand that in regards to taking those scenes and implementing it into the Star Wars universe, it should work, but unfortunately, the way that these characters are developed just is very lackluster. The filmmaking itself is hampered a lot, quite often, by George Lucas's writing and directing. So it's just a movie that, again, on paper, it could have been really, really good, but in execution, it left a lot to be desired. But again, it is slightly better than these other 2 prequels that I mentioned, and that's why I have it as my number 4. Next up, my number 3, we have American Graffiti. So American Graffiti, it came out in 1973, and I believe it was a Best Picture nominee that year. And when I saw this movie, I wasn't the biggest fan of it, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, okay, I understand with where George Lucas was coming from with this movie, where it's like a slice-of-life movie, following these kids and everything in their everyday life. And it's something that I wasn't that interested in, but I definitely liked it better than all these other movies, which is why I have it as my number 3, but I really don't have much to say about this movie. It's one of those movies where it's like, yeah, it's there, but I also understand historically why this movie was a hit when it came out. But now watching it, it's like, it's okay. So that's my number 3. Next up, my number 2, we have THX 1138. This came out in 1971, and I recently rewatched this. I mean, my apologies, not rewatched. I watched it for the first time, and I'm glad I finally watched this movie because I think that it's a film that it's one of George Lucas's best. Clearly, it's my number 2, but it's also one of those movies where it really makes me as an audience member think to myself, what if? What if George Lucas never actually directed the Star Wars movies? What if he just made these weird sci-fi movies? What would have happened? Because George Lucas, watching this movie, you can clearly tell that he has art house sensibilities. It's very clear. And it's one of those things where I'm like, it's a shame because he really liked going down the rabbit hole of making these weird art house abstract films. But once Star Wars, the original, came out, it was like, that wasn't something that he, was going to do anymore because it's like the money was just too good. And he always said that he wanted to go back to his art house roots, but unfortunately he didn't, which is kind of ironic because one of his best friends, Francis Ford Coppola, he actually went the other way. He made big films after making some smaller films, and then he went back to his roots in the early 2000s. Not a fan of Francis Ford Coppola's films of the 2000s, but I really give him props for actually going in that direction of just doing whatever he wants, making movies that he wants, and doesn't care about other people. I get that. I respect that. And George Lucas originally was like that. And to sum it up, watching THX 1138, you can definitely see that George Lucas was like that too. But things changed when my number 1 came out. My number 1, you probably guessed it, is Star Wars, 1977. So this is a movie that I would honestly love this movie the way a lot of people do, but what's holding this movie back is George Lucas. Here's the thing. If I watched this movie in 1977 when it came out, or up until DVDs came out, I would love this film. I really would. The problem is that George Lucas went back and he added a bunch of CGI that is in the middle of the frame, and so it is quite glaring and it takes you out a lot. Like anytime Jabba the Hutt is on screen, it's like, oh man, that's really bad CGI. A lot of times there's addition of animals or rocks even in a certain scene. And it's very obvious because it doesn't mesh well in the slightest with everything that was shot in camera in the original. So I hope that one day maybe we'll get George Lucas's original version and not the one that he CGI-ified. But as it stands, all we have is the stuff that he added, all the CGI additions. That's what we have. So it's one of those things where I'm between a rock and a hard place where I'm like, I would love this film even more and probably as much as other people, but those instances of adding the CGI, it really hampers this film. But as it stands, Star Wars is monumental. It is one of those things where it really changed cinema, as a whole, especially for blockbuster cinema. So in that regard, especially, I respect this film quite a bit. But I just think that George Lucas is his own worst enemy, especially in regards to the physical media editions. So I like Star Wars, but again, fingers crossed for hopefully one day getting a proper restoration of the original. But anyways, George Lucas, I like to talk about the director at the very end, usually, a little bit on if I like him or not. And I would say the best way of describing my relationship with George Lucas is that I want to love him. I really do. I think that a lot of times the premise of his movies are quite intriguing, but in execution, it's very sloppy. I think that when he's working with Steven Spielberg, that is when he truly was shining. Him and Francis Ford Coppola, they were helping out George Lucas. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Star Wars 1977 was as good as it was that he actually was leaning on them for, advice. So it shows. Anytime that he's leaning into his own sensibilities, unfortunately, the movies fall flat. And again, one of those directors where it's a shame because his early stuff like THX 1138 and the original Star Wars, you see someone that really wants to make these weird art house type films, but he just unfortunately caved in to doing the movies that, got him a lot of money. And it's like, I get it. Film, at the end of the day, for many people, it is a business, not an art form. So it's like, I get it. But this is where I, full circle, mention my relationship with George Lucas is frustrating because so much potential from an art perspective. But as it stands, I feel indifferent, unfortunately. But I also, at the same time, respect him with what he did in the early 70s and late 70s for cinema. So, anyways, those are my quick thoughts on George Lucas. Let me know your thoughts. Do you like George Lucas? Do you not? Do you feel kind of conflicted the way I do? Let me know in the comment section down below, as well as don't forget your ranking. And also, I do have a Patreon, so be sure to follow me on that. If you haven't followed me yet on Letterboxd, do that as well. And also, if you haven't done so already, don't forget the subscription, notification bell. Follow me down on Letterboxd, Patreon, and I will catch you guys later.